All right, folks. Look at him, mic'd up. Some of my students are like, he's loud enough, he doesn't need that. Anyway, I'm really pleased that you're here. My name is Bill Smetic. I direct the Leadership Studies program in the Center for Leadership Education. And we're very happy to have our speaker here who I'll introduce in a second as part of our Laben lecture series. And I just dropped my paper for introductions, which is never good. So there's a couple of people I want to thank. Emily Myrick so by the way, thank you for being here. We're also live streamed, and so we have students and faculty and staff joining us virtually through that platform, and we'll also be recording this in the future for people to use in classes as well. So thank those of you who are here for that. But Emily Myrick is the academic coordinator in our program in the CLE. She's a senior communications specialist, and she's helped with a lot of the arrangements here. Anusha just walked in. Anusha is a graduate student, and her partner in crime, Tarun, will be here as well. They've been helping me through last November since we started getting this all together. And then finally, a big thanks. We have the sponsor of this annual lecture is Gary Laben, who is here. And so Gary is an alumnus of JHU. He has a degree in civil engineering. He currently serves as the chairperson for the Center for Leadership Education Advisory Board. And his absolutely generous gift makes this annual program a possibility. So, Gary, I think you wanted to say hello to everyone?
Wanted to say hi to everybody. Thank you all for joining and being here. It's been an honor and a privilege to, over the years, have sponsored a number of these lecture series, and I hope to continue, and just pleased to see everybody, and thank you for being here.
We always appreciate alum support, so remember that. So back in early November, I was attending a conference that I'm a part of, the International Leadership Association, and I went to this session that our guest speaker was leading, and it was on this intersection of social justice and leadership education. And so to say the least, I was really impressed, not only with his presentation, but with him, and how he handled, frankly, the conversations after the formal part of the session was over. And so I went ahead and I contacted him to see if he might be available, Gary, to be with us today. And V got in last Wednesday evening. He met with a small group of faculty then. He's met with graduate students last night. He met with another group of undergraduates, the Clark Scholars, yesterday afternoon. This morning he did a wonderful session for all the CLE faculty in terms of what he brings and to help us incorporate some of the things that he's been researching and doing work on in our classes, and it was really terrific, V. Thank you. So V is going to tell you a little bit about himself, but he's an assistant professor for organizational and community leadership at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He'll tell you about the courses that he teaches. I found out that he's an editor for a journal that I have submitted a chapter to. So now I am in it. I'm just like, hey, how was it? And I'll be getting, as he said, I'll be getting his editorial comments soon. So I'm not sure how to take that, V. But we're very, very lucky to have someone of his research ability and presentations here, and the important work that he's doing on this important topic of social justice and how it intersects with leadership education. So without further ado, V. Or Dr. Chunoo.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm V. Chunoo, Assistant Professor of Organizational and Community Leadership. I'm incredibly humbled and honored to be here today to share some of my ideas, some of my thoughts, but also to hear a little bit from you as we work in community together to become better social justice leaders. Before I start with my comments, I would like to thank Gary Laben, not just for your support of the Laben Lecture Series, but for sponsoring my visit in particular. You should know the people around you have been incredibly warm, welcoming, and supportive. And for anybody who might have the opportunity to come back as a Laben Lecturer, I cannot recommend it highly enough. So I would like to share with you some of my ideas related to socially just leadership. This comes from both my research and my role as a teacher, but it may be helpful for you to understand a little bit about my history as we engage in this journey together so that you understand where I'm coming from and the context that I bring with you. As I tell you a little bit about my story, I encourage you to think about what your story means for you and the kind of life you want to lead as you continue to move forward and make change in this world of ours. So I am originally from New York, although I spent most of my life in Florida. Spent 25 years in the city of Miami in specific. I have a bachelor's degree in what was known at the time as psychobiology. I believe here in other places it's now referred to as neuroscience. And unlike most other people who get a bachelor's degree and leave, I decided to stay on, both as a full-time employee and a graduate student as I pursued my master's of science and education in mental health counseling. So people will often ask me, what do you do with a master's degree in mental health counseling? And I say, I am professionally trained in listening to people, which comes in incredibly helpful when you are both a teacher and a researcher in leadership spheres. So after I finished my master's degree, I continued on working at the University of Miami as what was known as an academic and career advisor in residence. I was one of 2 academic and career advisors who had offices in a residential college building filled with 900 first-year students. Please believe me when I tell you my office was between the front desk and the laundry room, so you can imagine the nature of conversations people want to have with you when they are new in college, potentially the first person in their family to ever attend a post-secondary educational institution, and they don't really know what they want to do with their lives. So I've had conversations with people about wanting to be doctors, but they can't stand the sight of blood. Really wanting to, their families really pushing them to become strong engineers and architects, but all they want to do is dance. So I got to get involved in really deep conversations with people, and one of the things you will learn is that if you do good work on a college campus or elsewhere, people will find more work for you to do. So as part of my time at the university, I was also an academic ombudsperson. If you're not familiar with what an ombudsperson is or does, that's kind of a good thing. An academic ombudsperson is an academic grievance officer. So I helped people work with processes related to accusations of discrimination and bias in the classroom, unfair grading practices, sexual harassment, all the way up to and including dismissal from the institution as well. So as someone who spent a lot of time as an academic advisor, someone who spent a lot of time as an academic case manager, I spent a good chunk of my day with faculty. And if you are someone who ends up spending a big chunk of your time with faculty, eventually one of them is going to turn to you and say, you should get a PhD one day. So I did, right? I could only avoid that advice for so long. They wore down my resistance over a number of years, and so I left the University of Miami, joined Florida State University's higher education program, where I did in fact earn my PhD in higher education. And while I was there, I not only discovered my love for leadership education, but decided to dedicate myself to it. My mission had always been to make higher education more effective, more efficient, and as accessible as possible to as many people who are interested. And it was really through that experience that I found a love and a passion for leadership education. It helped that I was also surrounded by faculty and support of other people who could help me launch my career in this direction. And if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here now. So that's my way of saying, this isn't my fault. I started working in the fall of 2002. We just recently finished the fall 2022 semester, so if you're doing the math fast enough, you'll know that this is my 20th anniversary of starting a career in higher education. I'm incredibly pleased to be able to spend it with all of you. If you've done any work in leadership education, or if you've had people who've tried to teach you leadership in the past, you may be familiar with Simon Sinek. Simon Sinek tells us many things about leadership. He reminds us to start with our why. You might be able to see the why, my why on the screen right now. My whole job in life and career is to make sure there's a roof over their head and kibble in their bowls. This is my white terrier mix, Charlie, who was adopted in Miami-Dade County, and my black Shih Tzu poodle, Milo, who is a pandemic puppy. So if any of you also got pandemic puppies, yeah, it's a real trip. Oh. So a little bit about how I intend on spending our time together today. We don't have a lot of time. I will try to move as efficiently as possible, but please know that I'm incredibly passionate about my work, and so I have a tendency to speak really quickly. If anybody in the room would like me to slow down, please signal me to do so. But I would love to share some of my ideas related to, so what exactly is social justice leadership? When we use these terms in this order all together, what are we actually talking about? And then I have a moment of reflection for us to make some decisions and to give you an opportunity to determine if any of the things that I am presenting resonate strongly with you. And if they do, why? And if they don't, why? After that short reflection, we'll take a few moments to talk a little bit about context and how we all play a role in building context where social justice leadership either flourishes or dies. Give us some tools, some language, and potentially identify some opportunities where we can be better, more effective, and more efficient social justice agents. And then finally, spend a little bit of time of thinking about, so where do we go from here? What are the tools and implements that we can use moving forward so that even though we might not be in this space together forever, we have something that guides our path as we continue on each of our journeys. Sound good so far? Online people, I hope you're doing okay. If you're seeing this from the future, thanks for joining us. So what exactly do I mean when I say social justice leadership? Well, I define lots of terms in my classes and my research, and what I often do is I start at the end and work my way backward. So if you've spent any time studying leadership, you may be familiar with Joseph Rost's post-industrial definition of leadership. You see it on the screen here in front of you. They, in this research, identify leadership as an influence relationship among leaders and followers who intend real changes that reflect their mutual purposes. Some of you may be familiar with this and you've seen it before. If you haven't, I encourage you to just take a moment, let the words wash over you. Pay attention to how they make you feel. Are there pieces of this definition of leadership that you already carry with you? Are there pieces of this definition of leadership that you've never really associated with leading before? And is there something in perhaps this phrase or these ideas as you see them presented before you that makes you feel some kind of way? Just take a moment and feel what that is for you. When I did this with the faculty, we had a 15-minute fight over words. This is what faculty do. So take a moment, think about that. You may or may not agree with this definition of leadership. I'm kind of hoping you don't, because it means that you're thinking about it and care about it deeply. But just in case I have convinced you, we will keep moving forward. This is the framework for leadership that I use to start. What then is social justice? Okay, this is the moment where I do the bad presenter thing, where you see a slide full of words. You were warned. This comes from Bell, Griffin, and Adams' Readings for Diversity and Social Justice. In those texts, they refer to social justice as both a process and a goal. The goal is a type of society that's formulated to protect all of its members in a way that everybody can fully and equally participate in democratic fashion. The process, then, is everything we do in service of that larger goal. The relationships that we build, the structures that we enforce, the conversations that we have, the policies that we enact, the way that we do and do not treat one another in that society, and what we're all willing to tolerate and withstand. So once again, I'll give you a few seconds. Maybe more than a few seconds. It's sort of a long definition. But if you've thought deeply about social justice, you may see some common elements as to what you've been wrangling with in some of the words that other scholars have also put together. If you haven't spent much time thinking about social justice, responsibly borrow these words. When I talked to the faculty, I said, steal these ideas. Can't really say that in this environment. And if there are things up here that make you feel some kind of way, that's the place where I want you to spend the most time. One of the biggest secrets about faculty life, sorry to tell all of our secrets, is that we're people who get paid to sit in the discomfort, come up with good answers, and then figure out if we're right or wrong. So this is what I work from in terms of a social justice definition. So you may see where I'm going with this. Some of you remember the show Glee. Take two songs that don't naturally go together, make them sound like they fit. We've just seen our two songs, so this is DJV's attempt. Some of you are fans. This is my attempt to make two songs that don't necessarily go together sound like they go together. To me, leadership is, social justice leadership is, a lifestyle characterized by authentic influence relationships between leaders and members who work toward full and equal participation of all groups in a society that is reciprocally shaped to meet their needs, and it comes with a commitment. The commitment is to changing that society toward equity, physical safety, and psychological security for everyone who's in it. Once again, take a moment, let the words wash over you. There are things that you like, things that you don't, things that you're not quite sure of. I want to be very clear about this particular definition of leadership. I did not wake up one day and write this down on a sheet of paper. This was 10 years of research, of writing, of talking, of working in community with other people, of being wrong, of trying to get it right, of being wrong again, and continually trying to get it right. So as you think about what does it mean to lead, what are you leading for, is social justice part of that conversation? And if so, what does that even look like? I'm hoping that there's something in here you can take with you. If you were to walk out of this room today, you've already got something to use. If you're willing to stay, the good news is I've got more. All right. So I work from a particular framework. This framework has a history. The history of this particular framework that I use started in really two places. Culturally relevant pedagogy from the K-12 educational sector, and campus climate research done on higher education campuses not unlike yours. Those two models were brought together in something called the culturally relevant leadership learning model. The culturally relevant leadership learning model is not a model of leadership. It is a model of leadership pedagogy. It does not tell us how to lead. It tells us how to teach leadership. However, if you spend enough time with a teaching model, you start to learn that, well, maybe there is something in here about how to lead in a socially just way, thinking of cultural relevance as connected. So myself, and some of my students at the University of Illinois have attempted to take the model that we inherited and turn it into something that could actually be a social justice model of leadership. What you're about to see looks wild if you don't spend a whole lot of time with theoretical models and frameworks. If you're an engineer, if you're somebody who's used to looking at building schematics or diagrams of how complicated electronics work, this is actually not complicated enough, right? Like you actually want to see more detail. But this particular model is what I work in my work when it comes to planning research projects, the outcomes that we're interested in, but also informing my pedagogy. Where am I orienting my teaching if I'm trying to create people who will go out into the world and make socially just change? The remainder of my time with you is going to be spent talking through this model. You may not choose to use it, and that's totally fine. My goal is to help you understand it in a way that is different and more impactful from the way you understand it right now, which is to say not at all, right? So we're going to take a few minutes looking at this, which is the middle section, these 5 elements with 2 ends. We'll spend, and then we'll have a short reflection. I want to spend a few minutes looking at those 5 concentric circles on the outside, talking through the contextual pieces of how we can create environments that foster social justice. And then finally, if you see that small circle of 3 arrows at the bottom, spend a little bit of time talking about lasting impacts and where we go from here. So let's start in the middle, in these 5 domains of social justice leadership. The original pedagogical model talked about identity, capacity, and efficacy, the first 3 arrows that you see on the top. As we continue to work through this model and refine it, we have added things like motivation and enactment to this framework. There is an emphasis in leadership learning in being able to disentangle the leader as a person, which is what you see on the individual side of the arrows, from leadership as a process, which you see on the opposite side of the arrows. As we have expanded this model downward, we also added language on the left and on the right so that we could try to wrap our heads around what do we actually do as we are trying to build each one of these characteristics into people as it relates to both their leader development as people and leadership processes for groups and teams. So we'll take each one in turn. The first one is identity, right? So what do we mean when we say identity? Many of you have a smartphone. That smartphone has a camera roll. That camera roll has a list of your selfies. I won't ask to see your selfies. But you may think about how if you scroll through that timeline, your vision of yourself changes. The way you look, what you wear, how you act, who you were with, what you were doing. And so in many regards, identity is exactly that. It is our personal timeline of how we have come to think about ourselves in the world. And there are at least 2 ways we might think about identity. First, as individual identity, the personal identities that we walk around with, the things that we believe to be true about ourselves that other people don't necessarily have to agree with. For example, Yankees fan. Nobody else has to agree with you that that's your identity, but you may retain one. I'm not saying that you are, but we have some evidence to suggest that might be the case. However, in leadership processes, often the idea of a leader itself is ascribed. Sometimes a leader is ascribed that identity because of their access to power, to privilege, to influence, to authority, responsibility, or simply because nobody else in the room wants to do something. And therefore they say, you are willing to act, you must be the leader. So part of what we do in social justice leadership is try to disentangle these issues so that we can grow people in both ways. How do we refine the way that you think about yourself? How do we refine the way that you manage what other people put on you as a part of leadership? Second is capacity. Capacity are the skills, sets, and the knowledge bases that we use to be effective leaders. Well, as we grow that in individual people, we're trying to make them more capable. So you might think of capability as the individual side of this capacity element. However, groups and teams also have abilities to both lead and follow effectively. So as we grow the people around us, whether it is through the mantle of leadership or through the mantle of followership and membership, we may think about how we develop competence, How do we make teams function better and more effective and efficiently? Third, we have efficacy, whether or not we believe reasonably that we'll be successful in anything that we try. An individual leader might possess confidence. I can walk into this space and know what I am doing and have the expectation that I'll be able to do it well. But groups and teams may also need a type of efficacy. We have labeled that efficacy agency. Part of what we might do in social justice leadership is not just build our own confidence, but build the capacity for collective agency. Third element is motivation, the intensity, the persistence with which we are motivated to lead. Many people in our society, or if you're familiar with psychology, are motivated by at least one of two types of things. Internal motivators, the things that we possess inside of our own bodies, and external motivators, the kinds of things that live outside of ourselves. I think in leadership circles, we often demonize people who are motivated by external factors. We tell them things like, well, you're just here for the paycheck. You're just here for the fame, for the prestige, for the title, for the position of the power that it gives you. My personal philosophy is, yes, and. So what if you are motivated by the paycheck? If you want to work in an organization where people are motivated by more than just a paycheck, perhaps you should give them more than just a paycheck. Give them a reason to stay. We aren't often as harsh on people for their internal motivations to do things, but some people have some pretty toxic internal motivations to do things as well. Perhaps if we understood how the people around us choose to operate and what actually drives them forward, we could best leverage that toward making society a better place for all of us, and maybe not shame them through the process. The next element is enactment, the behaviors of leadership. So what do we physically do with other people or do on our own? There are some folks that I've talked to over the course of my career that say things like, the definition of a leader is that you have to have at least a first follower. Without a follower, you cannot be a leader. And then I look them in the eye and disagree. I do think a bit about, and perhaps this is my own mental health counseling background, the self-work that we do that nobody else ever sees, that is necessary for us to accomplish leadership at a minimal level, and is certainly required if we are trying to work towards social justice. I disagree that you can't be a leader all by yourself in a room alone. I think the person that you're leading in that moment is you in the future. You are either setting up conditions that are going to make it more likely for you to succeed, or you are sowing the seeds of your own destruction. And we don't often talk about that as a part of the leadership conversation. We often talk about what are you doing for other people? How are you serving? How are you transforming? How are you adapting? How are you generating social change? We don't always talk about how you are generating personal change. So I think it's important for us to maybe pay attention to the self-work. On the other hand, we also have to pay attention to how people work together. So what are we doing to build the cooperative nature of our families, of our communities, of our student organizations on campus, and our workplaces on or off campus, and in our future lives? So I will ask, you've been a very attentive audience, but also quite quiet. Do any of you see yourselves in any of these 5 domains? These domains of identity, capacity, efficacy, motivation, enactment. And it's okay if you don't want to answer out loud, but you do have to answer to yourself. Do you see yourself here? When you think about the kind of leader you want to be, or do those elements relate? When you look at other people and you say, that's a leader, do you see an evidence of any of those characteristics? When you watch people work together and you say, that must be leadership, do any of those items play a role? So if anyone is interested in answering, I'm happy to listen. If not, we can also keep going. Yeah.
I think for me, I see motivation a lot. I'm on a team here at Hopkins, and the people in leadership roles often are the ones who clearly just want it and more, and so they care more about the team and like to put more time and effort in. And they also lead by example because they're so passionate.
Absolutely, absolutely. Leaders are the people who want it more. I'm hoping you'll let me reframe some of that for you. Leaders are the people who want it differently. Yeah? I'm not here to say leaders want it more or want it less, but I see something in them that might be a little bit different. Something maybe I want to copy. Something maybe I don't want to copy, because it's very easy to be self-harmful in leadership And if we are self-harmful in our leadership, how could we possibly say we're trying to serve communities, make people better, make the world a better place? When we're damaging ourselves in the pursuit of that, it doesn't seem like it's a path to where we're trying to go. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. So keep moving on just a little bit. I mentioned before this. Look familiar, right? Not so scary this time, huh? We can maybe make some sense of what's happening in the middle portion. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about those 5 circles that you see on the outside. As we think about the context in which this occurs, so this is the campus climate part of the research, right? This is the part that has come from higher ed. This is the part that came from studying people like most of you in the room right now, and people like that were undergraduate students. There are these 5 elements of contextual factors. For each one of these elements, as we've been thinking about how to incorporate them into teaching, into research, and into leadership practice, we came up with these bumper sticker statements, essentially, not only to help us remember what we mean when we say these things, but to help other people sort of have some advice moving forward. So you'll see in the next few slides, there's like a bumper sticker statement that sits in the middle of the slide. We think about the painful past of the context in which we operate, right? Whether that's the history of the United States, the history of the institution that we happen to be in now, the history of the communities, the programs, the institutions, the structures that we will choose to be a part of in the future. Every single one of these aspects of society has some history of inclusion and exclusion. I have yet to find some part of how we function in the modern day that has not been impacted by the influence of this. So we may have a responsibility of leaders not to shy away from the painful parts of our history, but to look it directly in the face. That can be a really scary thing if you are someone who has benefited from the privilege that history has provided to you. You didn't ask for that privilege, and yet you have it. It is certainly harmful for the people who did not have that privilege and still don't. So how then do we wrangle with this complicated set of social factors? Well, I encourage emerging socially just leaders to adopt at least this one piece of advice. We can't change the past, right? None of us have a DeLorean, can't get it up to 88 miles an hour, not gonna miss the clock tower in time. But everything we do today becomes part of tomorrow's history, right? In this moment, we set precedent for the next, and the next, and the next. So even though we might not be able to change the past, how can we alter the future so that we don't keep making the same mistakes, so that we learn our lessons? Because as we all know, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Thank you. I appreciate, I didn't mention before, but as I teach my classes, it's always one-third television show, one-third actual class, and then one-third therapy session. So if that ends up happening for us today, that's also totally fine. So yeah, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. If today is going to be tomorrow's history, we may not be able to change the past we inherited from before, but we absolutely have an obligation to make it different the next day and the next day and the next. So what do we do about that? What tool do we have? Well, here's the recommendation that we come up with. In areas where we have impact and influence, where we can change how people interact and react to one another, perhaps we are best served when we build a culture of recognition that is characterized not by moving on from history, leaving it behind as though it were irrelevant, but moving through it. To sit with other people in their painful moments and to protect them and to hold them gently and to say, it isn't your fault that it is this way, but we will make it better together. Second element is compositional diversity. When we talk about compositional diversity, lots of people hear the language of quota system. We need a certain amount of women. We need a certain amount of people of color. We need to hit these diversity metrics in order to have the kind of organization that we think will flourish. So we think about socially just leadership. That is an element of compositional diversity, but it's not simply enough. Spend enough time on a college campus, you'll hear language like, well, we need to get the right people on the bus. Or you might hear, everybody needs to have a seat at the table. I agree with this. I also don't think it goes far enough. I think you not only need to have a seat on the bus, you need to have the right seat for you on that bus. You not only need to have a seat at the table, you need to have a seat at the table where you can hear the conversation and contribute to it. That's very different from making sure you are on the right bus or at the right table. So whether we are the people who have influence on those environments, how do we do that? How do we make sure people have the right seat on the bus or the correct seat at the table? Perhaps it is by shifting organizational cultures toward mutual respect through using tools of brave vulnerability. Brave vulnerability is a hard thing to do. I don't quote Brené Brown often, but she has some good ideas. You may think about what it means to share the privileges that you do have so that people with fewer social protections can get the social location they need to succeed. Far too often, we have lots of people who have very good ideas, but if they feel like their voices don't matter and nobody supports them in moving through the system, they stay stuck where they are. And that's how we end up where we've been. Next element is psychological dimension, as it's described in the original literature. We have reframed it just a little bit to talk about it as a psychosocial dimension, because it's not just the intrapsychic work that we do, but the work that we do alongside other people as well. We think of this element of social justice leadership as unlearning some of the damaging assumptions that we not only carry with us that impact our perceptions, our beliefs, our attitudes, our values, and our behaviors, but we then replicate for other people and reinforce the same hegemony that they've already adopted. So as we're working through this for ourselves and doing the self-work, we may need to address how we can simultaneously liberate other people from the shackles that they have put themselves in while we free ourselves at the same time. How do we lift as we climb? This may require us to take a hard look at how society functions, how our organizations function, how our communities function, how our families function, how our friend groups function, so that we can break some of those damaging and oppressive cycles and replace them with something else, something closer to liberation, something closer to freedom, something closer to community connection, as opposed to simply replicating the status quo that we inherited from the past. The next is the behavioral dimension. Our voices matter the most when we use them, but if we don't feel safe in using our voices, we never will. If the conditions don't exist for us to be able to speak up, then we stay silent and things stay the same. Not everybody loves Star Wars Episode 9. I don't particularly love Star Wars Episode 9, but one of the take-home messages, one of the things they remind us of constantly in that film is that the Empire wins when it makes you feel like you are fighting alone. The behavioral dimension reminds us that we are never, never fighting alone. So how do we do this for ourselves and other people? We take on appropriate challenges. We build for ourselves and others opportunities to engage in ways that are unfamiliar to us and appropriately uncomfortable. As social justice leaders, we can't put people in dangerous situations intentionally. We can give them protections to do risky things safely. It's the only way we're going to make the kind of change we want to see in society, because society is not designed and oriented toward change. It's designed to insulate itself. We are, in many regards, fighting the insulation so that we can all be protected by something better. The last contextual element is what we refer to as the organizational and structural dimension. It is both the spoken and unspoken rules of what we do whenever it is we do what we're doing. How many of you are in classes right now? No, but actually, how many of you are in classes right now? Raise your hand. There we go. Yeah, you're in classes right now. Classes governed by many things, including the syllabus, right? The difference between a first-year student and a fourth-year student is that the first-year student studies the syllabus, the fourth-year student studies the professor. Right? There's a set of rules about how we're supposed to do what we were being asked to do in every single class. But if all you ever did was follow those rules, you'd never pass the class. There's always a hidden curriculum. There's a hidden curriculum for each course. There's a hidden curriculum for each year. There's a hidden curriculum for your degree. And if you go on for more degrees, I'm sorry, but there's more hidden curriculum to that as well. You go out into the world of work, even more. The people who succeed the most in higher education and beyond are the ones who learn to very quickly and efficiently decipher the hidden curriculum, to operate in its structures, and to get out as fast as you possibly can, with as little student debt as is reasonable. What if we change the rules? Not just the written rules on the syllabus, but the hidden curriculum of how to be successful in those environments. How could things be different? How might we be functioning differently? How might we be our truer and fuller selves if the invisible rules weren't working against us all the time? As socially just leaders, we may have a responsibility to not just identify that hidden curriculum, but to alter it as well. I believe that one of the best ways to impact things that seem intractable, like the organizational structure of how we live our lives, is to move the stories that nobody knows into the public sphere. Sunlight can be the best disinfectant. To be clear, the absence of social justice is more than the absence of social injustice, but we've got to start somewhere. this may be a place to start that conversation. So once again, a moment of reflection. As you think about things like the historical legacy of inclusion and exclusion, compositional diversity, psychosocial relationships that we have, the behaviors that we enact when we lead, and the structures that we learn to operate in as efficiently as possible, where do you see evidence of this in your life? Am I telling you stories? Am I gaslighting you? Like, am I rebuilding a reality that doesn't match what you actually have experienced? Or is there anything you've seen in the past few minutes that actually does make sense? You have actually seen this in the world. You can connect it to a story or to a person or to an interaction. I'm sorry, you nodded yes, so now I'm going to ask you to share, if you would.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you talked about like compositional diversity, right? And you mentioned how it's important not to just sit at the table, but like sit at a table where you can be heard.
Yeah.
I think nowadays you hear a lot of like about like diversity and inclusion, they kind of group together to one term.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, I was thinking about how like kind of being able to sit at the table is almost like I would say that that's kind of like diversity, where like there's people like anyone can sit at the table, but actually being included at the table, I think, is something that is more challenging to achieve. Where you feel like everyone, no matter your background, can really input into like the conversation. So that's kind of what I was thinking about.
And to be fair, for people who have been following the pattern of social justice in our society, getting a seat at the table was a fight. That was a battle. That was a war. There was a time when that was not as easy as it is now, knowing that right now, for some of us, it is still quite difficult, right? However, since we have made progress in that direction, we're not allowed to stop, right? So to your point of, there was a time, and there's still areas of societal functioning where the quota system is the definition of diversity. Do you have enough of each member from these demographic categories? If you do, good job, diversity done. We have realized that it is not enough to do that kind of thing. Many universities, perhaps including your own, many colleges, including perhaps the College of Engineering, will say things like, well, we need more diverse faculty. We need more diverse administrators. We need more diverse students. So what do? They admit people. We hire people, we have search committees, we bring them in, and then what happens? There's an expectation that the people with the marginalized identities are going to be the ones who create the environment for other people with marginalized identities to feel like this is a safe place for them. Why are we always waiting for discriminated people to do the work? I'm going to make a reference, and this part of the room is going to get it. What do we learn from Field of Dreams? If you build it, they will come. I apologize. Maybe some of you know that reference as well. If you build it, they will come. It never says, get the people here first, then we'll build the ballpark. It doesn't work that way, right? We know you have to build the structures first. Otherwise, the people are never going to come. And even among the ones that do, they're not going to stay because they don't feel safe. This isn't their place. They were brought here to meet a checklist, not to do the work. So what happens? They go somewhere else where they're able to do the work. And then in 3 years, 5 years, 6 months, you're looking at a strategic plan that says, we need to get more people of color and women, right back where you started. Anybody else have thoughts on some of the kinds of things we've been talking about? If not, that's okay. The last piece I want to leave you with is what happens at the bottom. So remember this. Looks super familiar now, right? The marketing works. Like you keep showing somebody the same product over and over again, and all of a sudden they recognize it. Even if they don't like it, it's familiar. So we spent time talking about leader as an individual, leadership as a process, and some of the elements that might connect. We've talked a little bit about how to create and what kinds of socially just environments we might be striving toward as we reformulate society. And the last piece I want to sort of present to you is, so what are some of the tools we have to do this moving forward? There's some pretty good evidence to suggest in both leadership learning spaces and in others that the following 3 items can be incredibly impactful in developing not just social justice agents, but social justice leaders as well. And the first is reflection. And it's a particular kind of reflection. Many of us engage in reflection on our own, and we think a little bit about what just happened to me. That's the kind of reflection that we engage, and that's perfectly fine. But as we think about reflection as a pedagogical tool, a teaching tool, a learning tool, and a leadership tool, it may not be enough to say, or it's rather to ask the question, what just happened to me? But it may be important to ask, how did it make me feel? What am I going to do about it? Right? And you may have noticed in some of the questions that I've asked, I've tried to model this for you already, right? What did you just see? How did it make you feel? does it create in you some kind of difference or change? So as we think about developing not just reflective social justice leaders, but also reflective social justice followers and members, this orientation to that process could be very helpful. Second is values. Leadership is always a values-laden process. It's never, for me, a question of, are there values embedded in this or are there not? The question for me is always, which values are embedded in this? Which ones do we name explicitly? Which ones do we hide and hope that people share when we try to lead, and then sort of wonder why things don't work well when they don't? So having some clarity around our own values, how that shows up in leading, and what that means for us as social justice and social change agents, also incredibly important. And the last one is meaning making, right? We spent a little time with the faculty earlier talking about the difference between the natural world and the social world. Social world is co-constructed. The natural world is not. If I let go of this object, we have a pretty reasonable suspicion of what's going to happen. Gravity does not require my belief in order to operate. Social structures do. It requires not just my belief, but my complicity. So I have to think about, what am I complicit in when I do the work of leadership? And am I truly serving a social justice mission? Or am I really trying to keep things the way they are, because the way things are benefit me somehow? If I'm receiving benefits from these social structures, chances are it's coming at the expense of somebody else not doing what they want to do with their life. So how do we change these rules to make it so that everybody can do what they want to do with their lives in a way that's safe and protective? So the question I'll leave you with, and I won't make you answer, and I won't pick on you for making direct eye contact with the speaker, is to think a little bit about, if you agree that things like reflection, values clarification, and meaning making can play a role in your development as a leader, where? Where might these factors fit in your life? You might be surprised at how easily some of this slots into the way you do the way you do you, quite frankly, on a regular basis. But now that somebody has told you, yes, you actually have permission to have this discussion with yourself, my hope is that you will engage in it. Much of this work was drawn from other people, so while I would love to take credit for their good work, I certainly cannot. However, some of this is mine, and I will take credit for my good work. I want you to know, bless you, as you are continuing on your leadership journeys, as you continue to make sense of this information, as we all work together to make the world a better place, I am not the faculty member with all of the answers. I am the faculty member with lots of questions and is willing to sit with you in the discomfort. Should you want to connect after this, this is where you can find me. You were so ready to applaud. It was great. Thanks once again to Bill Smedick and to his team for allowing me to join you, for taking such good care of me, for feeding me so well. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
We do have a little bit of time
Yeah.
if you'd like to comment or ask some questions. We'd love to have you do, oh, sorry, I'm getting a word from the back to use the mic. So if any of you have any questions, comments that you'd like to make, we'd love to hear from you. Bailey.
No problem.
What piece of it, because obviously a lot of research and a lot of deep thought.
We're getting a mic for you. This may be very helpful for our remote audience as well.
Okay. Well, thank you again for coming today. And with your diagram, obviously so much deep thought and process went into it. Which aspects did you find most difficult to be able to explain clearly to an audience that may not be as familiar as you are with it?
Yeah, all of it. So all of it is difficult to explain, right? I think all of leadership is difficult to understand. This particular model, I've been trying to share it with as many people as possible, in part because as I instruct, one of the questions I often ask my students are things like, is this model too simple to actually work in the real world? Is it too complicated to maybe measure accurately? So when I think about the explanation of this particular model, there actually is no one singular element that's difficult to explain. The hardest part with me and audiences is helping people understand how it all fits, right? It's the connection, it's the pieces that you don't see. How do we actually do this in a real and practical and applied way where people could see change in their communities? Or if you were doing one of these kinds of things, how would you even know you were doing it, right? Like what evidence could we produce to suggest that you are on the right track or that you're moving in an appropriate direction toward these kinds of outcomes? So for me, explaining the model itself is not all of that complicated. It's really helping people, okay, great, now what do you do with it? When I talk to faculty members and administrators and the paid adults in the room, my concern is always that they will come to a talk, they will get the handout, they'll ask important questions, we'll have a great conversation, and then it sits on a spot on their desk that they've reserved for that material, that the next time they have a workshop, that handout goes on top, and then the next workshop, that goes on top, and the strategic plan from your dean goes on top, and the assessment report from your VPSA's office goes on top, and it all just sits there, nobody reads it, right? It just collects dust until you're ready to move offices and it gets chucked out the window. Trying to make this particular model useful, meaningful, actionable, that's what I care about the most, right? Many of us have map apps on our phone. If you follow the map app blindly, it will take you into a lake or a river. I'm not trying to take you into a lake or a river. We always need to find ways of getting the map to match the terrain, right? So the hardest part of all of this is figuring out, as I go from place to place to place, sharing these ideas, this is a map I carry with me. Help me make it match your terrain. Thank you for the question. It was actually a really good one.
This is more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
But
Great. I don't have to answer.
Yeah, I had a thought that came up twice, and the first time it came up, I didn't really notice it. But then the second time it came up was when we were talking about the reflection, values, and meaning making.
Yeah.
It first came up in learning from your past experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So what came to mind was just. I'm halfway through college, and I feel like I haven't figured out a good balance between work, school, career, and
Mm-hmm.
taking care of my own health.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I'm reflecting and would
Mm-hmm.
like to take responsibility and actually figure it out very soon.
Yeah, that's great. So that wasn't a question, so I don't have to respond, but I will react, right? And I'm going to stand over here for a moment because this is closer to where the paid adults are in the room to say, we haven't figured it out either, right? Please don't think that we show up for class or to a meeting or to a research project or to a guest lecture and we've got it all figured out. We actually don't. We've just spent more time with the problem. We've had more opportunities to make more mistakes. We have not learned from more mistakes than perhaps you might have at your stage in life. So that's to help normalize that experience. The second thing, so what do we do about it, Dr. V? How am I supposed to fix this problem? And the answer is there's no one single solution. But the following idea may be helpful. I try to think of my life as a series of seasons, right? So am I in my health and wellness season? Am I in my career development season? Am I in my scholarly development season? Am I in my relationship growth season, right? And unlike the climate-based seasons, there's no time frame associated with this. I give myself permission to say, this is what I'm working on now. I'm going to do as good of a job as I can with it. I will need to change my attention at some point. I will take the things I learned from this season of my life with me. And the nice thing about seasons is that they happen all the time. So I can always go back, right? I'm not locked into one particular kind of thing. The danger, of course, is what you just described, trying to be in every season simultaneously. I can't be in winter, spring, summer, and fall all at the well, I don't know. I've seen the weather outside. Maybe you can here. Wait, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes, it'll change. But to think of yourself, right, the story that you tell yourself about your own life, even in reflective practice, is what have the seasons of my life been so far? What season do I feel most comfortable in? What season have I not experienced in a really long time and maybe I need to get back to? If you think of your life as having a type of climate pattern, then all of a sudden there's a lot less fear and guilt and shame associated with focusing on one or more parts of your life because you know it's going to come around again. I'm curious, does that help? She wants to say no.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I said before, it took me a second to come to the conclusion that this related to what you spoke about. So probably more reflection.
Yeah, for sure. I hope it is helpful. I genuinely hope it is helpful.
Thank you.
There's one over here. Ooh. Boop the table.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, I missed you yesterday. I'm sorry.
You made it today, so
I
you did it.
I'm here. So a couple things, and part of it is something that you've talked about. One, the implementation, right, in the terrain. So I'm on the other side of the ledger where we're in the practice side.
Sure.
And so wondering about, how you've seen this show up in practice in terms of places where it's been implemented. But on the theory of the case, I philosophically struggle with self-leadership. I am more of a leadership, followership, role model
Sure.
person.
Sure.
In terms of, I've always felt that the word leadership gets bastardized and everything becomes leadership.
Yeah, we use it to sell cars and chicken nuggets.
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
yep.
yeah. So how do we in this model kind of distinguish between when we're talking about self-leadership versus being a good role model versus this is just what you're supposed to do.
Sure.
This doesn't make you a leader, it has to happen.
Right.
Right. So how do we kind of talk about that? Because with students, we tend to just say everything you do is leadership.
Right.
And I
And
don't
whenever-
want to go down that road either.
And when everything is leadership, then nothing is, because it's
nothing
not
is
distinguished
leadership.
from anything else.
Yes.
That's right.
So that's my
Great.
that piece, and then ultimately, where has this been picked up? What does this look like in
Yeah.
practice?
Right.
Because that's something as we're thinking about leadership
Yes.
at the institution outside of the classroom. That's a question.
Absolutely. So I will say there is a researcher at the University of Tampa. Her name is Dr. Anna Maya. She just last semester defended her dissertation. Her entire dissertation study was entirely empirical validation of this model, or a version of this model, with her own presidential leadership fellow scholars across all 4 years of enrollment and along a variety of these dimensions as well. So from a practice perspective, we have some evidence to suggest that these things work and that there are measurable outcomes associated with the identity work, with the capacity work, with the efficacy work, with the ways in which we might motivate people towards social justice action, and that the climate pieces are not just things that we can create for other people, but other people create for themselves as well. Like that's one of the big findings from our dissertation, is that it's not just the teacher, it's not just the administrator, it's not just the program lead, it's not just the role model. We do it for each other all the time, which is something this doesn't account for, but her data suggests that it does.
Okay.
So there is absolutely empirical evidence to support this, and there's more coming. One of the problems is that this model is incredibly new. We are still refining it and making sure that we are accounting for the variety of ways that it can be used in a practice environment, starting with the ways that it is already used in the practice environment, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah. The second part, you talked a little bit about the self-leadership piece and how do we distinguish, say, self-leadership from role modeling. If everything becomes leadership, then nothing does. I think part of that is also why I ask questions like, when I say leadership, this is what I mean. Does it also resonate with you? When I say social justice, this is what I mean. Does it also resonate with you? When I say socially just leadership, this is how I've tried to make these two songs fit together. It is part of that differentiation process, right? So if you were looking at that and you say to yourself, oh, I'm doing something to be a good leader, but it doesn't necessarily fit Dr. V's definition, you now have a sense that, according to Dr. V, that's not social justice leadership. It might be something else. It might be influence, it might be power management, it might be relationship building, but if it's not serving these purposes in this particular way, then it's actually not leadership. It could be servant leadership, it could be transformational leadership, it could be adaptive leadership, but to understand where in the broad landscape it fits helps us categorize and organize our thinking and acting in that particular way. And that's not to say transformational leadership or adaptive leadership or servant leadership or social change leadership can't lead to social justice outcomes. It's just not designed to. This is by design oriented in that direction. And many of those models and theories don't talk about self-leadership, and it's also why I try to make kind of a big deal about it, because it happens and we don't talk about it, which makes people feel like they're doing it wrong. So let's not make people feel like they're doing it wrong. Yeah.
I want to go back to your comment about the empirical evidence showing that this model works. I just need help translating that.
Sure.
What does it mean that this model works? And like, as a out of the classroom educator, how am I implementing this?
Right.
How am I working on each stage at a different point in a program?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I didn't mean to cut you off in case there was, okay, no. So what do I say when I mean the model works? What I mean is, for example, in the focal program, they might do an activity or spend an evening talking about identity, ascribed identity and personal identity as part of leadership practice. Later on in the semester, when they have a conversation about, well, have you thought about how identity and your social identities and your ascribed identities and your personal identities impact your leadership practice, students can answer that question. They can articulate it in a deep and meaningful fashion and not just talk about the work that they are doing, but the work that they are doing in community with other people. Same thing for capacity, same thing for efficacy. So I don't want to get overly, research methodologist on you, although I could. There is some suggestion that when we put this information in front of people who are learning leadership, it creates, you can use an ag metaphor, it creates in them a seed that grows over time. And when we ask them later, how is your plant doing? There's demonstrable growth in those patterns and in those capacities, and also in the environments that they try to create for and with one another.
So in some ways, what you're saying, it's the teaching the model.
Well, I believe in that setting that students aren't actually taught the model. The model is used to inform how they are taught. So in that environment, they wouldn't necessarily put this up in front of a student, but this is what the syllabus is based on, this is what an activity is based on, a reading assignment is informed by these decision-making, a reflection paper, a written assignment, a podcast episode, a video for class. You had mentioned something else and I wanted to talk about it, and I lost the thread of the second part of your question. It's important. If I'm going to work in this modality, I have to do all of these things all of the time, always, otherwise I'm doing it wrong. That is also not true, right? The idea behind using this as a pedagogical strategy is you pick the one or ones you want to work on in this week's class, or in this month's program meeting, or in this semester's event and workshop schedule. No one singular thing can touch all of this at the same. I can barely do that, and I'm presenting on it as content. If I'm trying to use it as a process to inform how I work with other people, it would have to be something incredibly intense in order to do all of this all of the time. This you might think of as a menu of options, things we can focus on over long periods of time in combination with other things that we're trying, other content, other experiences we're trying to build, so that collectively and communally we get to a place where all of this happens. And it may not always happen with the same intensity, at the same time, in the same way. That would be unreasonable, I think, for anybody who is trying to work in this modality. But great, a pair of great questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. V. I think as a student myself, I think also most students, we're at this stage of our life where we have just gotten awareness of what leadership is.
Yeah.
And then I think we just first start to develop our individual leaderships. And I think we're mainly invested in our individual leaderships. Mm-hmm. Of course, we have visions and social justice, kind of wanted to make the world a better place. But then,
good.
But then, do you think that now is a good opportunity for us to be aware of some of the bigger leadership processes that you talk about? And do you think that we should try to actively work toward that process, or should we focus on our individual leadership properties first before we go on to the next stage?
Yeah, that's a great question. So once again, I'll answer it using an ag metaphor. I work in an ag college, so I've learned all of these things in the past 5 years. My colleagues will often tell me, the best time to plant a tree was yesterday. I think the best time to think about the intersections about social justice and leadership was yesterday. The second best time, right now. Right? It's always, right now is always the best time for social justice. You asked an interesting question about should we pay more attention to our leader development, or should we pay a little bit more attention to our leadership development? Which comes first? Is it a chicken? Is it an egg? Do you need both? The way I think of it is these are two structures that scaffold one another. As you were building your ability to be a good leader, you were also building your ability to be in leadership processes together. I actually think it's quite difficult to focus on one and only one and grow in that direction. Are there some experiences you're going to have that are more focused on your development as an individual leader? Yes. But you are still learning how to be in community with other people. Are there going to be instances where you have opportunities to learn more about leadership as a process? Yes. But that learning necessarily has implications for how you see yourself and other people. So I would encourage you to worry less about whether you are primarily focused on leader development or primarily focused on your leadership development, but do that meaning-making piece of, today I became a better leader because I understand leadership better now because, right? For me, it's not an either or, it is both and. That's probably not the answer you want to hear, because like, oh no, I gotta do twice as much work. We've solved the problem.
Thank you. Another round of applause. Gary, Pam Sheff came to visit. She's the director of the Center for Leadership.